Baltimore. In the summer of 1996, wears a certain fatigue after dark. Pavement cracked like old lips, weeds shouldering through chain link, a heat that hangs even when the sun is gone. On the edge of an industrial lot sat a single-story trailer that didn't look like anything worth remembering. The door stuck. The hinges complained. The smell did the rest. Inside, police found what their training pretends to prepare them for and never does. Bones on the floor, not animal. Plastic containers in the refrigerator labeled as if someone were meal prepping for a long work week. More in the freezer, stacked neat. The man who lived there was 6'1", 450 pounds, and smiling. He did not run, he did not bargain. He sat in a chair and told them, almost conversationally, "I killed them, cut them up, and some of them I ate." His name was Joseph Roy Methany, and if you want an origin story, you have to listen to A Kind of Silence. He was born in 1955 into a world that would not have noticed if he'd slipped out the back. An alcoholic father died in a car wreck when Joe was 6. His mother worked doubles, sometimes triples, dragging tomorrow's exhaustion into today's shift. In houses like that, children learn to forage for attention, and if they don't find it, they hunt other things. The picture people offer of Joe at school is a familiar sketch. Quiet, withdrawn, a boy who watched more than he joined. The accounts closest to him split the difference. His mother said he was smart and polite. Those who shared space with him noticed the corners of his mouth pull upward at things that aren't funny. He picked fights. He hurt animals. He seemed to like the sound certain acts make in the air when other people flinch. At 18, he joined the army. He would later claim Vietnam. The drugs, the killing, the switch that flips a man into something else. Records say he never left the United States. The war he carried lived behind his eyes and did not require geography. When he came home, he climbed into the spiral he'd been building. Heavy drinking, crack cocaine, jobs that learned his name and then forgot it. Trucker, forklift operator, the kind of labor that wears a man down behind his knuckles. He learned, too, how to live where others don't look. Abandoned factories, under bridges, the dark places under the city that preserve secrets in damp air. By 1994, he was living with a woman and their son. One afternoon, he came home to an apartment arranged around absence. She had taken the boy and left. She had not left a note. She did not owe him a sermon to explain why. What Joe chose to believe mattered more than what was true. In his telling, she had run off with another man, and that belief was enough. It metastasized into a grievance against every woman who resembled her in the ways that mattered least. One night, high and sweating, he took an axe and went looking. The bridge in South Baltimore where his girlfriend used to score is a geography lesson in social neglect. Tents, tarps, small communities organized around a handful of rules. She wasn't there. 2 men were. They slept under tarps. He hacked them to death while they dreamed. He rolled their bodies into the river and watched the water take responsibility. It did not stop him, it trained him. In the months that followed, Joe lured 2 sex workers, Catherine Magazina and Kimberly Spicer, into his trailer with promises that would feel predictable if they weren't so effective. Drugs, a quick rest, a little cash. He strangled them, dismembered them, and eased the meat into Tupperware like leftovers. Then he did something that still makes stomachs harden when you say it out loud. He mixed human flesh with pork and beef, ground it together, grilled it, and sold it from a roadside stand to truckers and locals on their way to work. Homemade burgers, cheap. He told police later, almost proud, "If you mix it right, no one can tell." The line fits him the way an alibi fits a liar. Too well. There is a psychology to that sentence, and it is not complicated. Dehumanization is work. It requires language and repetition. Call a woman a trick, a junkie, a problem. Put her into a category the culture already discounts, and the mind has less friction when it decides she is spoilable. Add euphemism, meat, product, mix, and the action needed to turn a person into a patty becomes a kind of unthought. Moral disengagement doesn't always arrive dressed as ideology. Sometimes it wears an apron. The mechanisms are old. Blame the victim, diffuse responsibility, rename the act, deny the harm. Under the hood, each step makes it easier to do the next. Glasp. He developed a ritual. Crack, beer. The crackle of grease on a grill. A jaw working while a body cools. Containers labeled with the tidy lies of domesticity. He would sit on the porch of his trailer and smoke, a man resting between chores. Neighbors saw the size of him and mistook it for gentleness. Co-workers called him quiet, funny in the way that doesn't cost a room any effort. The camouflage wasn't clever. It relied on our laziness, on the human desire to be done thinking. Despite his weight, he could move quickly when he needed to. He knew where to park a truck so a scream would be swallowed by traffic. He knew where to dig a shallow grave behind a trailer so the ground wouldn't sink and the weeds would reseal themselves by morning. And he learned the oldest lesson of predation. If you build a place where what you want comes to you, you don't have to hunt. They came to me, he told police. I didn't even have to try. But a ritual that confident always grows sloppy. In December 1996, he murdered Kimberly Spicer and failed to disappear her fast enough. He asked a friend to help him bury the body. The friend chose a different direction. Police searching the trailer found Kimberly under a tarp. Blood where blood shouldn't be. Knives where you'd expect knives to be. And plastic containers full of mystery meat, whose label does not neutralize the fact of what it is. Under interrogation, Joe's face worked through a limited repertoire. The bored smile, the narrowed eye, the shrug of a man who believes the worst thing about getting caught is the inconvenience. He confessed to 8 murders and suggested the number was probably higher. He talked about dismembering some of his victims while they were still alive, as if he were clarifying a recipe. In court, his lawyers pushed the familiar levers: drugs, trauma, a childhood devoid of predictable tenderness. These are explanations, they are not absolutions. The jury needed neither absolution nor metaphor. They had the fridge, they had the meat grinder. They had the girl whose blood refused to be washed out of plywood. They had a defendant who treated life like something that can be combined with pork until it doesn't taste like anything but pork. In 1998, a judge reached for the largest word the law has: death. Later, that sentence was commuted to life without parole. In 2017, at 62, Joseph Roy Methany was found dead in his cell. No trauma, no spectacle. A body in a quiet room, the opposite of what he'd made of others. There are, inevitably, questions people ask at the edges of this story that say more about the askers than the man. Did anyone eat it? How many? Did they get sick? The truth is that curiosity sometimes tries to protect itself with trivia. The better question is harder and more useful. Why did so few people ring alarm bells earlier? Part of that lies in the social weather of the mid-1990s. Those the culture devalues are more easily disappeared. Sex workers, women struggling with addiction, the unhoused. If someone disappears who has already been taught they are disposable, the paperwork to find them is thinner, and the hours to look for them fewer. Metheny selected victims the world had already failed, and that selection is not incidental, it is strategy. Another part of the answer is appetite as method. Joe did not just take life, he incorporated it. He recycled horror into commerce. He turned people into product and then offered it as hospitality. There is a primal violation in the act of feeding someone a body you killed. It reverses the relation between host and guest. It writes dominance onto the most basic form of trust we extend to strangers, the food we accept from their hands. When he sold burgers to men in work boots at the edge of a city that believes it has no time for thinking, he was conducting a performance in which the audience didn't know it was on stage. Stand for a moment with the investigators at the fridge. Plastic containers click open with that domestic pop. Inside is a violence that will never again be translated back into a person with a mother and a name. Stand, too, with the woman who knocked on Joe's trailer door for cigarettes and believed that the worst thing she might get was a broken promise, not a broken body. Try, without success, to make the words "mix it right" mean anything other than the refusal to recognize another human as human. Try, also without success, to picture a scale capable of weighing the relief of a commuted sentence against the absence it was handed to weigh. When people tell this story, they often can't resist an urban legend shiver, as if the grotesque content makes it less real. It is not less real. It is a case file with numbers and timestamps and exhibits that chain together into a rope no imagination can cut. The lesson is not only that one man did unspeakable things, it is that he spoke about them with the voice of someone who believed he was simply describing a system that worked for him. Inputs, outputs, a process he had refined. That is the part we must learn to hate without becoming blind. The way an ordinary tone can carry in it the blueprint for annihilating another person's status as a person. Joe is gone now, and the trailer is emptied, and the lot has moved on to other uses. But somewhere, there's a man who remembers a cheap sandwich that tasted fine on a day he had to be at work by 3 p.m. Somewhere, there's a mother who keeps a photograph facing down on a dresser because the day insists on being lived, and the only way to live it is to look less. Somewhere, there's an investigator who still cannot stand the smell of raw meat. And everywhere, there are corners of our cities where the people most in need of counting are the easiest to miscount. That is where predators build their porches. That is where we have to look longer. From Baltimore's antiseptic fridge, we descend a set of stairs in St. Louis, into a basement where a chair is bolted to the floor and a camcorder's red light blinks like a patient eye. Our next file belongs to a man who did not want simply to kill. He wanted to author. He left maps. He mailed taunts. On the wall of his playroom, he wrote the kind of welcome that ruins the word. Welcome to my dungeon. We will go down there. We will not look away. It began with a map, folded once, then again, slid into a plain envelope and mailed to a newsroom that had already moved on. No return address, no signature, just an X in red. Ink pressed a little harder than the other marks, as if the hand that made it wanted the paper to bruise. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch had run a short piece about bodies found near highways and vacant lots. Women strangled, wrists bound, lives filed under unsolved. The article did what such articles do, stated the facts, suggested caution, went to print. The letter did something else. It pulled the city by the sleeve and said, "Look here." Detectives took that map to the woods near West Alton, Missouri, a place where trees crowd each other and insects own the air. They didn't need dogs. The ground told them where to kneel. Under a shallow quilt of leaves lay the decomposing body of 34-year-old Alicia Green, a mother missing for nearly a month. Her wrists were tied behind her back with an electrical cord, the ligature's memory still written into the bruised flesh of her neck. Whoever sent the map was not guessing. He was curating. He had a name, Maury Travis, born in 1965. The childhood summary reads so normal it anesthetizes. Middle-class neighborhood, no juvenile record, quiet kid, polite to teachers. But some people specialize in silence. Classmates remembered the way he watched, how he seemed to be studying a room for exits that didn't exist yet. In high school, he discovered a small doorway in his mind that led to darker rooms. Bondage magazines, elaborate drawings of women tied to chairs and blindfolded. If Patrick Kearney was a technician of control and Kenneth Granville a liturgist of it, Maury was an author. He needed to write the story, to choose the verbs and the camera angles, to sign his work even when he didn't sign his name. Down in the basement of his home, he built a set. A metal chair was bolted to the floor as if someone might try to take it away from him. Ropes and duct tape lay coiled like patient snakes on a table. A camcorder sat on a tripod, permanently pointed toward the place where a person would be transformed into footage. There were ball gags, handcuffs, a drawer of syringes, and, in a cabinet, women's shoes in a dozen sizes. Tokens he could handle when there was no one in the chair. Across the wall, neckties looped into nooses hung like a catalog of endings. What happened in that room did not require imagination. He brought victims there and removed their names. He bound, gagged, shocked with a stun gun. He injected drugs to keep them awake enough to understand. He forced words out of them and fed those words back to the camera. When he was finished, he killed them, often by strangulation, and dumped their bodies as if he were done with a task he intended to repeat. There's a psychology to this we cannot ignore. Domination rarely sustains itself on violence alone. It feeds on reclassification, on the mental shift from someone to thing, from her to it. Once a person is renamed as an object or an enemy, it becomes easier to justify harm, to mute the tug of empathy, to obey the cold logic of control. Social psychology has long warned us that dehumanization, turning people into categories you're permitted to handle, greases the skids from thought to atrocity. The mechanisms aren't complex, they're chillingly simple. Label, distance, obey the script, repeat. But authorship has an appetite beyond control. When a Post-Dispatch article downplayed connections between the murders, suggesting coincidence where he wanted credit, Maury snapped. He didn't want his work mistaken for noise. He wanted byline-level attention, so he sent the map. He didn't know that modern attention is a jealous god that sometimes eats its devotees. Investigators began with the paper and the printer. The letter had been produced on a public computer. The police cast a net around local copy shops, and soon a Kinko's surveillance tape returned a face that matched the quiet, polite man who answered the door in a tidy suburb of Ferguson, Maury Travis. When detectives knocked, he opened the door as if this were an ordinary evening. He said he had nothing to hide. He hesitated when they asked to look around. Then he led them downstairs. They took in the chair first, the way it was fused to the concrete, the flake of paint where someone had clawed. Then the tripod, the duct tape, the neat rack of ties, and finally the writing on the wall, more theater than confession. "Welcome to my dungeon." It would be melodrama if it weren't true. The tapes told the rest. In one, off camera, his voice laughs while a bound woman begs. In another, he forces a victim to choose how she will die, as if choice could rinse the cruelty from the outcome. In yet another, he turns the lens on himself and speaks directly to the people outside the frame. The police, the city, us. "You're never going to catch me," he taunts. Then he labels a scene, number 17, as if we were following along in a series. On June 7th, 2002, they arrested him and booked him on 2 murders. The number was a procedural artifact. The reality felt bigger, older, uncounted. In interview rooms, he was not a man exhausted by confession like Kenneth, nor an accountant of logistics like Patrick. He was a director who had lost the rights to his film. "They were already broken," he said when asked why. "I just finished it." He would not name other victims. He smiled when detectives pressed. He knew leverage when he saw it. The justice system gathered itself. Warrants were typed, boxes sealed, inventories made. The newspapers ran photographs, some blurred, some not. Friends and neighbors performed the generational ritual of trying to reconcile what they thought they knew with what the basement made undeniable. Meanwhile, Maury made a final editorial decision. 5 days after his arrest, before a prosecutor could step into a courtroom with a stack of tapes and a theory of the case, officers found him in his cell. He had used a bedsheet. He left the world the way he controlled it. Alone, without apology, with the last word secured. The legal proceedings ended. The questions did not. How many? Investigators estimate as many as 20, perhaps more. Some bodies were never recovered. Families waited by phones that forgot how to ring. Some tapes were too degraded to identify the faces. Others were juvenile. A girl's wrists too small for the cuffs. Her voice a sound you don't ever stop hearing. The basement held more than evidence. It held a library of stolen endings, each frame a subtraction that left the world permanently smaller. If the Kearney case taught us that discipline can make a killer invisible, and Metheny that appetite can masquerade as hospitality, Maury Travis shows how authorship multiplies the harm. He was curating his violence for an audience. The map was not just a clue, it was a press release. The chair wasn't just a tool, it was a set piece. The camcorder changed the physics of the room. Pain became performance. Humiliation became content. He wanted to be a narrator of his own cruelty, and he wanted the world to listen. The early 2000s were a hinge moment for that desire. Digital breadcrumbs had begun to outpace the confidence of men who thought anonymity was permanent. Surveillance cameras didn't sleep. Copy shop computers kept logs. Printers and scanners carried invisible signatures, and retail timestamps became witnesses. A killer who craves recognition cannot hide in a network built to remember. The map that brought police to Alicia Green did not only lead to a body, it led to a Kinko's. Renown and evidence share a door. The basement still sits in the city's memory the way a bad dream sits in your day. Too bright in a few details, smudged in others, all of it refusing to fade. And if there is a place to put the rage that rises when we watch those tapes, even in description, it is in the insistence that the women in them are remembered in the plural of their lives, not the singular of their deaths. Mothers, daughters, sisters, friends, people who laughed in kitchens and took double shifts and made plans they never got to keep. Maury tried to collapse them into characters in his story. Refusing that collapse is a form of justice the courts can't adjudicate, but communities can. The last frame in this chapter is not a cell or a chair. It's a living room where a woman turns off a television because the news is showing the red X again. And for a second, her child's backpack looks like a target. It's a detective in a copy shop, watching a fuzzy loop of a man standing at a terminal at 2:17 a.m. It's a printer humming, a map spooling out of the tray, a hand folding it once, then again, as if the paper might whisper back a different ending. We climb the stairs now and out into air that carries other stories. In Cedar Grove, Louisiana, a taxi idles outside a house that will not be a house by the end of a morning. In Shreveport, boys learn how to hold their breath. In a lab in Baltimore, a volunteer badge opens a door it shouldn't. The next file begins with a scream no one heard and ends with a door to death row that never opens again. We move on because these cases teach us in different dialects of the same language. Control, disappearance, return. The air in Louisiana is heavy in summer, the kind that presses down on the chest and makes even ordinary mornings feel uneasy. In Cedar Grove in 1985, a taxi idled outside a small house while its driver waited. A woman named Shirley walked up to the door, knocked, and froze. Through the glass, she saw shapes that didn't move the way people do. She ran, screaming, back to the cab. Minutes later, police stepped into a nightmare that would carve itself into memory forever. Inside, 2 adults lay in a bedroom, one shot, the other stabbed. Down the hall, a teenage girl was bound with electrical cord, her throat slashed, her body marked by a kind of rage that takes its time. In the bathroom, another woman slumped against the tub, her face bruised, her life ended by strangulation and drowning. 2 children survived by hiding in a closet, small bodies trying not to breathe too loud while violence moved from room to room. The killer had left no calling card, no forced entry, nothing to explain the kind of annihilation that strips a home of its name. But in a corner of the drywall, a clue whispered louder than fingerprints. 2 words carved into plaster. I prayed. It was less a confession than a corruption, a blasphemy written into the architecture of grief. The man behind this was Nathaniel Robert Code Jr. Born in 1956, raised by a great-aunt and grandfather after his parents split, he carried into childhood a quiet disassociation. Teachers described moments when his eyes glazed mid-sentence, as if the room dissolved around him. Neighbors remembered pets that disappeared, fires that started small and unexplained. At 15, after an argument, his uncle shot him 4 times. He survived, ran several blocks before collapsing. The wounds closed, but something deeper split open. At 19, he was arrested for breaking into a woman's home and assaulting her. He served nearly a decade in Gatesville State School, a facility infamous for its brutality. Released for good behavior, he came back into the world with paperwork that read rehabilitated, though the truth was closer to redirected. In 1984, he attacked Deborah Ford in her own home, stabbing her repeatedly before slitting her throat. Police labeled it a mystery. Less than a year later, he escalated into massacre. The Cheney Colbert household became his stage. Vivian Cheney, her daughter Kalitha, her brother Jerry, and a family friend named Billy Joe Harris, all murdered. The violence was deliberate, not frenzied. Each bound, silenced, extinguished in methodical order. 2 younger girls watched from hiding, carrying into adulthood the knowledge that silence is sometimes the only weapon you have left. Code did not stop. In 1987, he killed his own grandfather, William Code, the man who raised him. He tied, gagged, and stabbed him 13 times. 2 children visiting the house that night, 12-year-old Joe Robinson and 8-year-old Eric Williams, were also strangled. Nothing stolen, nothing gained but control. The personal nature of the act snapped investigators' focus to Nathaniel. FBI profiler John Douglas studied the cases and saw patterns others had missed. Control layered over rage, domination as ritual. During questioning, Nathaniel slipped on a detail too precise for an innocent man. Fingerprints from earlier scenes sealed the rest. At trial, witnesses painted contradictory portraits: polite worker, loyal friend, short-tempered shadow. His lawyers argued mental illness, borderline personality disorder, the complexity of a man divided. The jury didn't hesitate. Guilty. Death. Since then, Nathaniel has lived behind the walls of Louisiana State Penitentiary, filing appeal after appeal. None succeeded. In 2013, he tried another route, suing the prison for extreme heat in his cell. He said it was cruel. families of his victims spoke up with disbelief. They reminded the world that their children had not lived long enough to grow uncomfortable in summer, that what he called inhumane was nothing compared to the fire he had brought into their lives. The Cedar Grove survivors, those two girls in the closet, grew up carrying memories that never left. Every door knock, every raised voice, every shadow at night replayed the echo of that morning. Some wounds heal over. Others remain raw forever, just under the skin. Nathaniel Code's story isn't only about the brutality of his crimes. It's about how violence hides in plain sight, wearing the mask of ordinariness until the mask cracks. It's about the way systems release men stamped rehabilitated into neighborhoods unprepared to test the truth. And it's about the burden of memory, carried not by the killer but by the living who saw what he left behind. Louisiana's heat will rise again this summer. His appeals will sit in folders. The girls who survived will sit in kitchens where they cannot forget. And Nathaniel Code will wait for a door that will never open, on death row, where silence has a weight all its own. Next, we move north again, to Baltimore, where another quiet man learned the uniforms of trust, the language of authority, and used them not to save, but to steal. Charles William Davis Jr. wore the face of a helper, but behind that disguise, he wrote his own ledger of the dead. Baltimore, 1975. A city that has always balanced grit and promise. Row houses in long lines, the harbor lights, the hum of industry. But sometimes danger wears the same face as help. That was the disguise Charles William Davis Jr. carried. A man who drifted through life like a shadow you only notice after it's gone. Born in 1947, the son of a police officer, Davis grew up with no dramatic childhood markers that people usually point to later. He wasn't the boy who set fires, nor the kid expelled from school. He finished high school, served in the Navy, and trained as a lab technician. He looked like the neighbor who might fix a flat tire for you or hold a door open at the hospital. That was the trick. He wasn't exceptional in any way people knew how to fear. But Davis was studying something else: vulnerability. He spent years volunteering with ambulance crews, working at hospitals, and learning the small rituals that make people relax around uniforms. He knew how to move in spaces where people are bleeding, afraid, or just grateful for help. The trust wasn't earned. It was borrowed, worn like a badge, and returned at the end of a shift. But Davis never gave it back fully. He kept a piece for himself, and that piece became his camouflage. In December 1975, Kathleen Cook, a 23-year-old nursing student, walked alone through a dim hospital parking lot. She never made it home. The next morning, her body was found beside her car, 4 bullet wounds in her chest. Nothing stolen, no obvious motive, no sign of chaos, just precision. Her friends were questioned, her co-workers too. No one thought to look at the quiet volunteer who had been around the ER. 8 months later, 22-year-old Peggy Pumpian vanished from a laundromat. Witnesses remembered her speaking with a man who carried a clipboard, wore a technician's patch, and had the calm authority of someone doing his job. Her body turned up in a grassy lot days later, a single bullet to the head. Clothes rearranged, hands bound, no theft, no fingerprints, clinical, clean. Davis's killings were not born in frenzy. They were controlled, almost surgical. He wasn't chasing rage, he was pursuing order, and the order required practice. In early 1977, he escalated with Carol Willingham, abducting her from a grocery store lot, assaulting and beating her before executing her with a bullet behind the ear. Unlike his earlier crimes, Carol fought back. She clawed his face, screamed so loud passing cars noticed, and her struggle left a trail. Security cameras, still rare in those days, captured his car, blurry but enough. Davis fled west to Nevada, still wearing his false costumes of authority. This time, he tried to abduct another woman under the guise of being an EMT. But she fought back hard. She saw his face clearly and lived to tell it. He was arrested on the spot. And when Baltimore detectives started digging, they found his shadow stretched far behind him. The confession came with a calmness that unnerved seasoned investigators. Davis recited murders as if he were reading from a manual. He described the words his victims spoke, how they froze or begged. He remembered details only the killer could know: the jewelry, the way bodies fell, the way a bullet mark looked in a shirt pattern. The search of his apartment gave the rest away. In drawers, earrings, bracelets, hospital ID badges. In a locked cabinet, a journal filled with names, codes, GPS-like coordinates. It wasn't a diary of guilt. It was an archive, a hunter's log. Some names matched missing women. Others were initials, or nothing more than blank lines, open slots waiting to be filled. What's chilling about Davis isn't just the violence, it's the methodical patience. He didn't storm into lives like a storm. He slipped in quietly, used the tools of trust, and rewrote the meaning of safety. He weaponized the very symbols, uniforms, badges, clipboards, that people are trained to lean on. In that sense, he represents something broader. The way predators use systems of care to gain access. The way trust can be turned into the most dangerous disguise. He was convicted of 3 murders: Cook, Pumpian, and Willingham. But detectives believed the journal spoke to many more. Dozens, maybe. When confronted years later about a cold case, Davis, by then in his 90s, confessed casually as though remembering where he had parked a car. 50 years of silence ended in a sentence. I strangled her in my car, promised to take her home, and left her in the ravine. The details were still there, waiting, unsoftened by time. Charles William Davis Jr. is serving life without parole. He is the embodiment of how normalcy itself can be a predator's greatest weapon. Not a monster in the shadows, but a man who wore the face of a helper while his hands undid lives. Next, we leave Baltimore and cross into Connecticut, to a patch of overgrown woods behind a strip mall where a scavenger stumbled upon a shallow grave. That grave turned out to be one edge of a place William Howell would call the Garden, a burial ground he built victim by victim.